And welcome to the Senate Suite here in Durham Castle. My name's Roger Masterman. I'm the head of the law school here at the university, and am delighted to be able to welcome you all to my friend and colleague Tom Brooks' inaugural lecture. Tom is the newly promoted Professor of Law and Government in the law school. He'll be known to you for his work on political philosophy, as well as on punishment, as well as on the life in the UK citizenship test. Mm-hmm. And his leading works, I think, in the area include his 2012 publication on punishment, his book on Hegel's political philosophy, now in its second edition, and his work on citizenship and immigration, which has been debated from the heights of the House of Lords to the depths of the BBC Two Mock the Week programme. So I will leave it to you later on to debate which is the higher of those two accolades. And without further ado, we'll pass you over to Tom, who will be talking to us this evening on why Hegel matters.
Right. Well, thank you everyone for coming to the show. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. And thank you, Roger, for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate that. I've been very lucky in many ways coming to Durham. One of them is to be in such a great law school with a great head of school. So great to have all of these friends and family here tonight for this lecture. Now, the inaugural lecture of professors has if you go back to the 19th century, say 19th century Germany, had a particular kind of importance. And part of the importance was that until one had an inaugural, someone wasn't a professor. And if you weren't a professor, then that meant, amongst a great many other things, it meant that you were temporarily employed. It meant that your employment was ad hoc, that you didn't have any secure livelihood of any kind. You relied on, not even year to year, but a kind of a term to term, hoping someone would take your class and so you'd be able to eke out a living. And so the inaugural lecture was important in the 19th century, in Germany, and also in this country, as marking out you've got a permanent job. So that's part of the thing of it. And also with the inauguration of a professor, you started as a professor with the inauguration. It's often called having a chair. So being a professor of law and government, being a chair in law and government, being the same thing. And that comes from, in those olden times, students would sit on benches, and the professor would sit on the chair. There'd be one chair in the firm. So having a chair meant you had the chair. So today I'd like to talk about Hegel, someone whose work in philosophy has been very influential on me, both as a project in intellectual history and also for thinking about contemporary issues, such as criminal justice, sentencing in particular, thinking about political justice, and also thinking about citizenship tests, amongst many other things. And I'm going to say a few words about Hegel, what his project was all about, and why I think he's relevant in areas like that tonight. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel is widely seen as highly important in the history of philosophy. He was born in Stuttgart in 1770. He died from cholera in 1831 in Berlin, shortly after being made rector of the University of Berlin, newly established. At his height, he held the most prominent chair at the new university. He had enormous power and influence at his time. But to some degree, we might think much of his high influence, anyone who works in philosophy would put him in their top 10. I would put him top 5, but anyone would put him in the top 10 of the all-time important philosophers. But much of that influence, we might think, is a negative legacy. Part of that reason is biographical. When Hegel was a young student in the theological seminary, he originally trained to be a theologian. His friend at the time, Friedrich Schelling, was seen as the real philosophical talent. So when they were both 18, 19, Hegel was seen, he was called the old man by friends at the seminary for having old-fashioned views about things when he was young. And Schelling was the guy who was going to glow. Schelling was the guy who we'd all be reading and talking about today. Schelling rose rapidly from his studies. He became a full professor at the age of 26. His star continued to rise until, and as it was rising, Hegel would write, saying, "Hi, old friend, I'm still not making much of a living. Can you get me a job? I'd like to be a little bit like you. I'd like to work in the same department," and so on. But at the height of Schelling's fame, he was involved in a scandal, he lost his job, and his fortunes declined. But Hegel, the slow burner he is and late bloomer, kept at it, and his star started to rise. When Hegel took up his chair in Berlin, he was, as I say, enormously influential, and he was the second person to hold that position of professor of philosophy. And when he died, the chair passed over to Schelling, who had finally made it back again. He had re-emerged from his scandal. But Schelling, jealous of his old friend's fame and influence, decided that he was going to make the job of being chair to ruin and destroy the Hegelian philosophy in Germany. Now, Schelling's philosophy is stuff you might not have heard of. That's probably the first time any of you have ever heard that person's name. But I bet you've heard of his students and the people who came to study with him in Berlin, where he taught them Hegel's philosophy and why it was bad. One of them was a guy named Karl Marx. Have you heard of Karl Marx? Another one was Friedrich Engels. Together, Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto. That had a history. Friedrich Nietzsche came to study Schelling in Berlin. Soren Kierkegaard came to Berlin. So the founders of literally Marxism, communism, the founders of existentialism, radical new ideas about theology, all studied at Schelling's hand and learned about why Hegel was a problem. And perhaps even more famous of all, Friedrich Nietzsche came to the lectures of Schelling on why Hegel was bad in Berlin those days. So Hegel has been extremely important, but part of the reason he's been very important is he's someone you need to know to understand these monumental figures who came afterwards, like Marx, who claims he was turning Hegel on his head, or Kierkegaard, or Nietzsche. So there's a question about whether or not his relevance for us today is only negative, or does he have something more to contribute to us today? Now, Hegel is seen as not only as one of the most important philosophers, but also one of the most difficult to understand. I think that's safe, of the major philosophers. So this quote by the controversial Ted Honderich in a 1967-ish book on punishment. All this, of course, is obscure, after quoting Hegel. It is by Hegel. And that's a typical put-down for much of what Hegel's about, that he's just waffling on about anything. This problem of being obscure and difficulty is one that has led to serious debates about what his philosophy was and about. The first debate was the political debate. This was whether or not Hegel was an apologist for the Prussian absolutist, totalitarian almost regime. And you see in his work, Hegel's work, comments about the highest ethical achievement of the citizen is to be a citizen of a state. But of course he's talking about a certain kind of state, and not just any kind of state. Others have rejected that right-wing interpretation of Hegel and adopted a more extreme on the other side, strong left-wing. Hegel is the proto-Marxist. So in comments I'm going to talk about later, Hegel comments that in current capitalist society, there's the central problem of poverty and the creation of what he calls a rabble that threatens to undermine society and our relations to each other. Some have read Hegel as, wow, this great progressive spirit who has these wonderful ideas that foreshadows the glorious communist future in Marxist thought. But now, where the debate is on Hegel's politics, is largely settled. The view that he's neither extreme right-wing or left-wing, that he was politically moderate. He likes states, but not any state. He's worried about capitalist society, but not willing to give it up. Not willing to give up capitalism, willing to accept some of the problems, and so on. That's a debate that is over. There's a second debate that I hope to help overcome myself. And this is a debate about the metaphysics in Hegel's account. Now, some of us in the room are deeply steeped in metaphysics and others I know are not. So a short version about what metaphysics is about, it's largely things that exist, things that we can point to, we can say they are, but that they're not physical. We can't touch them. So my bad example for many of my students is rights. So rights exist, I've got a right to free speech. But where is it? Where do you touch it? Where do you find it? Well, it says this here. Well, that's an example of something metaphysical. Things that exist that we can't grab hold of physically, amongst other examples I could give. The metaphysical reading of Hegel is one that highlights the comments that Hegel makes regularly about states being better or worse than others. True states, false states. States that could be more just or less just, more or less. Actual states, political states. One of the problems of this language is he appeals in making those arguments to a distinctive view about how the mind works and how it relates to the world, and also a distinctive view about religion in the world that some find controversial. To overcome potential controversies in how we understand Hegel's work, there's been the dominant reading of Hegel's philosophy, the non-metaphysical reading, which largely looks at Hegel, tries to abstract from his self-understanding and says, he might say such and such is important, but it's not really essential. When Hegel talks about religion and the importance it has in the state for citizens to be good citizens, he's really just appealing to principles. He's not really getting into some deep theological views about stuff. The non-metaphysical view, in sense, has been one trying to package Hegel in a way more acceptable to modern eyes. In some sense, removing him I think, away from how Hegel might understand himself. That is a debate in Hegel scholarship that continues. But let me say something about why there's such debates about his work. So how can someone be so important, but yet so badly misunderstood at the same time? Well, one is that Hegel offers us a very curious systematic philosophy. And he's seen in the history of philosophy as the last person to create the great big systems. So today, a lot of people in the room, some very good and several old friends of mine working in philosophy, you focus on a problem or an area of philosophy. And you stick to that. You worry about ethics. You worry about philosophy of religion. But you don't do everything. Hegel does everything. He wanted to create a system of philosophy that could account for all things that philosophy dealt with. He created what he called an encyclopedia of the philosophical sciences. These were broken across 3 different areas. Logic, which was how he thinks the ways in which we comprehend the world, how we understand objects and relations between self and other. He had a philosophy of nature. This was about, of course, the natural world. You probably figured that out already. But also about sciences. So he talks about chemistry and physics and biology, which he thought was the highest of the physical sciences. And also spirit. And spirit means human spirit. So the human spirit that he focuses on is stuff like psychology, ethics, politics, religion, history, art, and so on. Each of these areas he thought were related. He tried to develop the way we comprehend the world through his logic and then apply it to our understanding of nature and spirit. Part of the problem here is, of course, that's a lot of stuff. That's a lot of arguments to have. That's a wide view to encompass. So he doesn't do it all in one place. He does it in a series of different books. The problem is, when you pick up one text that he wrote, you need to understand it in light of all the others that he did as well. And some books only look at some small part of each of these things as well. But to make it even worse and more difficult to understand, his work was largely published in outline. So instead of providing a book with the arguments, so this is my view about business ethics or other things, or the state, or art, how we should understand art. No. Hegel instead gave a small outline, gave some juicy lines to his students, and said this is a drawing of Hegel teaching his students from the chair, as they sat at their bench. He would say, right, students, I want you to read sections 20 to 32 next week. We have some big comments, somewhat connected, and we'll see you next week, and I will then lecture about those. And so when we come to study Hegel, that of course is a difficult thing you're looking at an encyclopedia of philosophy developed across all areas of human knowledge, largely in outline, supplemented by student texts that we have. This work is interrelated in the system, so to know nature, to know human spirit, to know about morality, politics for him, is to know the logic and how it relates to the other parts, and how these parts interrelate. So it means you have to, in some sense, understand his whole gamut of thought, and then go back to see how it's places. To understand one area is to see how it fits into the others. So, one of my works on Hegel's political philosophy, I tried to show that the metaphysical versus non-metaphysical debate was a false debate. People were saying they were having an argument about the kind of controversial metaphysical views that Hegel had, but it wasn't really about that. And one of the things I tried to argue was that people who claimed they were non-metaphysical readings, the dominant view, what they were doing is they were reading Hegel's texts independently of a system. They weren't non-metaphysical. They were recognizing metaphysics happening of various kinds. They just thought they were doing the non-controversial metaphysical readings, the ontology. But they were reading it non-systematically. They would read a text away from the system. And part of that project was to inoculate it from what they thought the crazy stuff elsewhere in the system, usually identified as the philosophy of nature and the logic. Likewise, people were arguing for the metaphysical reading of Hegel's work, highlighting the connections between his political and legal philosophy with his work on religion and logic and elsewhere. It wasn't really a metaphysical reading, it was about embedding Hegel's texts within the system. What both sides were doing, it was really a debate about where certain works of Hegel fit in his system. Was Hegel right that his work should be read in a systematic way, or not? And so one of the things I wanted to argue was that that was what this debate was really about. And that when people argue the other, they're actually doing something implicitly, this is what they were actually doing in fact. Now one example of how this works is probably, if anyone knows anything about Hegel, probably the two most famous arguments or views that he has is one is the critique of Kantian ethics. So this is critique of the other great German philosopher, vaguely of his time, Immanuel Kant, who had a view that if you want to know what morality looks like, what you got to do is follow a moral law. And there's a moral law that works to some degree like the laws of physics. So physics the laws are universal, they're timeless, and the knowable, the reason. Likewise, Kant argues, the moral law is something like that. So the moral law is universal. It's something, he thinks that we think of a formula, we can all act the same way at the same time, roughly. This is part of his argument. There's more to it than this. About why murder breaks the moral law. The thought is that we can't all murder each other at the same time. It'd be the murdered and the murderers. Which side are we on? And so on. So he has this kind of simple principle. We think about how that works, and that's how we determine what the moral law is, whether or not our actions are moral or immoral. Hegel rejects this. If you look at the particular passage, it's often highlighted because it's an empty formalism. Things that Kant is just following an empty equation. We're just following a kind of a mathematical equation of sorts without dealing with the content. And the argument is what makes things moral or immoral is not whether or not they satisfy some form alone, but it has to do something about the content. There has to be something immoral in the action, rather than just merely it's just not consistent if we all did it at the same time, whatever that means. But if you have a more systematic grasp of what Hegel's project is, and you look at how these different parts relate, one of the things I think, and one of the things I argue for in the book, is that this critique misses something very important. And that is, when Hegel's critiquing Kant's views on morality, he's not just critiquing Kant. He's critiquing what he takes to be everybody doing moral philosophy. He takes moral philosophy, using his own terminology, the typical move in the 19th century, and to some degree 21st century philosophy, define our own terms and criticize others for not living up to them, how we define certain things. He thought that moral philosophy is just about my thinking about my relation to another, in abstract, in my armchair, such as thinking about, are my actions consistent or not? His critique of Kant, if we look at the passages in the Philosophy of Right and elsewhere, have the same character. Where they all fall down is he thinks ethics is not about equations, it's not about thinking only about you and me, it's about thinking about people situated in the world, in relation to institutions, what he calls our ethical life. So to think about what is right and wrong purely in relation to can we do something at the same time or not, to think about it purely in terms of a principle or two, he thinks misses the mark, because instead what we must do is think about ourselves as situated as members of a family, people in civil society, members of a state. These overlapping spheres of activity that we have. So if you look at just the page, you see one view of what you might think Kant's critique, what his critique is of Kant, but actually it extends to many others and has a consistent character from beginning to end. The other is his views on history. Hegel is the guy attributed with the thought that history is over. Thank you, Francis Fukuyama, for that great big error. The end of history is nigh. Now, part of the reason why people think this is if you take out the book, series of lectures, The Philosophy of History, Hegel wrote, they talk about history has happened. When we look at it, we find, apologies to my friends from China in the room, that China, he thinks, is at the beginning of history, deeply insulting from what little he knew, and that, of course, the German sphere was the height, epitomized by Scandinavians and the English. The height of philosophy. That's where we're all directed to. So if you look at this text, it looks very clear. Hegel has cast judgment. Northern Europe wins, other places hope to live up to their high ideals. But the problem of this non-systematic view of looking at his work independently of his other work, which works for just about every other person who writes philosophy, it works for Harry Potter novels, it works for lots of other things in life, to some degree Lord of the Rings, to some degree. It doesn't work for him. Why? Because when he's talking about the philosophy of history, he's very self-conscious in the beginning. This is related to his particular view of philosophy. Famously encapsulated by the sentence, the owl of Minerva only takes flight at the onset of dusk. Wisdom happens after the day is over. Philosophy is a looking over. Philosophy doesn't tell us what to do next year or next week. It looks at what's happened and tries to make sense of what's happened. And in light of what we think we know of history, we see it organized, he thinks, in a certain way, organized by his logic. If the facts change, he's very clear. We reorder it. Things change. Peoples change. The order changes. Hegel can't have a view of the end of history because he has no view of the future. His only comment, famously, about the future is that the land of the future was the United States of America. Why? Because the Germanic sphere had gone to the New World and was forging things from scratch. He was deeply dismissive of the people already there for a long time. And so these kinds of views about Hegel, common views that most people think they know, I think you can criticize, be critical of, when you see them in place of their place in the wider system. But these are all comments about how academic philosophers have understood Hegel and the debates that they've had, just to give you a flavor about what this is, as many of you may not have come to the study of Hegel before. I will now want to change tracks, and I want to talk about why he matters, why this stuff matters. This guy, he was very controversial, who wrote an outline trying to capture all of human thought in a big encyclopedia, philosophical sciences. How should and why should we care about this today, other than intellectual history alone? part one of my case here is thinking about crime and punishment. So this has been an area of interest of mine for a very long time, and it was one of the things that made me originally interested in Hegel's work. We see one comment from his key text on political and legal philosophy, The Philosophy of Right, these words. And again, if it looks dense and abstract, it's because he's only giving you parts. He's summarizing his argument for you to reflect on over the week that he'll deliver in class. And students in the room of mine, you're welcome. I won't do this. I think it won't be very good for scores or anyone's learning. But one of the things he has here is crime, its danger to civil society, is a determination of its magnitude. So when we're trying to think about how bad is a crime, how worried should we be as a society about crime, well, one of the things you have to think about is its danger to civil society, its threat to you and me as members of civil society. He says it varies according to the condition of civil society, and therefore a penal code is primarily a product of its time, the current condition of civil society. So one of the thoughts here is that one of the ways that Hegel's been understood, one of the most popular ways for thinking about punishment, is that we should think about it in terms of retribution. Give the deserving what they deserve. And what you've got to do then is think about what people deserve and then get right what that equivalent is to it in punishment. And so what you're looking for is one punishment forevermore that will be the right thing. So murderers, maybe death, others, life imprisonment. You're trying to come to one view that'll be fixed, what people deserve, as a fixed fact. Hegel's arguing that view can't be right. The common understanding of Hegel as a retributivist also can't be right. Because the relationship between crime and punishment, how much we punish crime, is not fixed. It can change over time. It can change in relation to how you and I in civil society feel threatened by acts of crime. Is there a moral panic? Are we really worried about child sex offenders more now than before, though the crime is the same? Also, Hegel says, when a state is in civil war or in war, you should expect sentences to go up. The punishment will be more severe. What's changed? Theft is theft. Murder is murder. Other crimes, speeding, parking tickets, all this has remained the same. What's changed is the context. And for Hegel, the context is essential to understanding how crime and punishment interrelate. But what he's done here is he's hit upon this thought. So when we see crimes come and go, once upon a time there was witchcraft. Once upon a time it was severely punished. Once upon a time, capital offense for stealing horses. Not so anymore. What's changed? Well, why are some things crimes then and not now? Hegel's explanation is, well, we don't feel threatened by this anymore. It doesn't have any magnitude for us at all. It doesn't register. But it doesn't say then, that passage, much about what we're supposed to do. So I'm worried about it. Society is lacking social capital. There's lack of social trust. And so in those societies where we're increasingly isolated from each other, where we look at each other with fear and antagonism, when we become more isolated from one another, those will be societies where we should expect civil society is broken down and the sentences will go up. Now that's an interesting sociological observation perhaps, but how do we actually do this? How do we think about this? Well, Hegel is relatively quiet about this, but there is one place you can look if only you dared. One passage, I think, that is key to understanding Hegel's ideas on punishment is found in what's seen as probably his most difficult work, coming to, in the English translation, to over 850 pages, The Science of Logic, which he thought was the most important text for understanding his philosophy, and one of two he actually did write all the way. So it wasn't just an outline, it's actually, the full argument allegedly is there. Here he gives punishment as an example. This is in the middle of the book, page 465. I won't read it out. But what he says is something that is still, he starts off saying something that I think is still true today. When people think about punishment, we debate. What is its purpose? We take sides. Do we think punishment should be determined as retribution? Give the deserving what they deserve. Or do we think it's about deterrence? So what we want to do with punishment is we want to make an example of people. And we want to deter potential future offenders. Or is punishment about reform? Is it about rehabilitation? Is that the focus of punishment? Now, one of the things that makes Hegel's views on punishment really revealing and eye-opening, and some will say alarming maybe, is he says that while each of these have been considered the ground of punishment, when people thought about what punishment is, people defend each of these. And traditionally today, normally people take sides. They say, I'm going to defend the retributivist camp against deterrence, or I'm going to defend deterrence against rehabilitation, and so on. For Hegel, the one that is taken as ground is still not the whole punishment itself. There's a suggestion that when we think about retribution, deterrence, and rehabilitation, these might look like three different views on punishment, but they're not separate. And people who have argued for one against the others are making a mistake. Really, they're all the same. Now, this is not obviously true. One reason is, imagine someone is damaging cars, hopefully not right now, outside the cathedral. And I know some people have cars there right now. So bad example, someone's damaging cars outside. Now I might deserve punishment of some kind, 100 hours community service. But say this has been a problem for a while, and the master of the college is very concerned about this, as are others. And so what people deserve isn't leading to any kind of change of behavior. So to satisfy multiple principles of punishment, we should make greater examples maybe of others to have a deterrent effect. So, to punish people as much as they deserve can be different, can be a different value, can be a different punishment, kind and duration from what might be sufficient to deter people. So it's not clear that these different principles of punishment come together. It seems that actually, when you think about it, they should clash. Now, why think Hegel has this perspective? Why think Hegel thinks these three things come together? He suggested that one of these is not the whole thing itself, but is he saying that all three are one? Now, he does like trinities, and I suspect that there's a reason for this I won't get into. But one reason to think that this is his view, 3 in 1, that these are three different sides of the same thing, is when we turn to people called the British idealists, the British Hegelians. We have one amongst us here tonight. This is a picture of T.H. Green. T.H. Green, writing in the late 19th century, he and his other British Hegelists, also known as the British Hegelians, working in Victorian England and Scotland, and Hetherington in Wales, did two things. One, they introduced Kant's philosophy and Hegel's philosophy to an English-speaking audience. So that Kant and Hegel are dominant, important figures in the history of philosophy for English-speaking people, like many of us in the room, we have them to credit for this. So they introduced the teaching of that in their universities, primarily of Oxford, Glasgow, St. Andrews, and a few others. The other thing that the idealists did is they tried to take the work of Kant and Hegel and synthesize it. They tried to bring it back to life. So we have Kant, and Hegel's got a critical view on it. They're trying to square the circle. They're trying to perfect this project. They're trying to embody it in conditions local to Britain. And it's then, I think, highly interesting that these people who are selling Hegel's work anew, the people who first to propose this in our country, have this view of punishment of 3 in 1. Where did they get that? They're trying to sell the views of Kant and Hegel and embody them today. So Green, in his lectures on political obligation, is commonly asked, of course, Green not providing an outline and providing his arguments, unlike Hegel, so a useful guide to help us understand Hegel's views. It is commonly asked whether punishment, according to its proper nature, is retributive or preventative or reformatory. The true answer is that it is and should be all three. And this view of Green is not unique to Green. So other idealists, Bernard Bosanquet and others, say the same kinds of things. What this helps us do is realize a Hegelian view of punishment is that we shouldn't be for retribution or deterrence or rehabilitation, but some combination. What's unclear is how do you do it? What does it mean to have this idea of unification of these different theories of punishment at once? Part of a guide to our thinking about this comes from a later comment in the same work from Green, also echoed in the work of others, especially James Seth says a lot of comments like this. Punishment is a disapproval founded on a sense of what is necessary for the protection of rights. And here is a suggestion that punishment is about the protection of rights. There's a common commitment to restoring rights, this kind of metaphysical language that gets some people worried about Hegel. And what do we restore? How do we protect rights? How do we think about it? Well, we think about it maybe through some combination, some use of retribution, deterrence, or rehabilitation. What will help us get that goal? Or so it is suggested. Now, what is fascinating about this that may not be obvious is that this idea that punishment is justified with reference to multiple and possibly competing purposes is our law today. So these ideas in early 19th century Germany, I think that you can find there, and definitely there in late 19th century Victorian writers like the British Hegelians, you see in the sentencing guidelines we have today. So there is a link to today. With these guidelines, you see in the Model Penal Code, United States, it was designed because a lot of the individual U.S. states have got their own laws relating to theft and murder and robbery and so on in those individual states. And this Model Penal Code, amongst many other things, was trying to bring some harmony and consistency across states and how these offenses were defined and how they were punished. And the Model Penal Code, very influential in the United States, and you'll see influential in England and Wales as well, says that punishment is justified through a variety of different principles, such as retribution, deterrence, and rehabilitation. These ideas that Hegel talks about, when you think about punishment, it has this threefold character, they come together, and that's what justifies it, is something that you see now. Likewise, here in this country, the Criminal Justice Act 2003, when we're thinking about sentencing, when we deal with offenders, we must have regard to the following purposes of sentencing. This is repeated in all sentencing guidelines for England and Wales. Magistrates, justices must have this in mind. And this also is about retribution, deterrence, rehabilitation, and it adds more. Reparation could be another purpose of sentencing, protection of the public, and so on. Now, one of the problems that these views have is that they give us a list. But they don't tell us how to use the list. So, I have regard. But I'm not obligated in England and Wales to say how I had regard. So I don't have to say which of these I thought about when I sentence. I could. But I don't have to. I can talk about them in combination. Very few do. But how do you weigh up these competing principles? The problem with much of how this is done now is that it lacks this unity. And that's one of the things that the Hegelian approach has tried to offer us. So one of the ways I think that Hegel can matter for us today, and something that I thought a lot about in my more recent work about contemporary philosophy of punishment, is trying to think about what that Hegelian model might look like now, developed in this context. How it is relevant, and it speaks to things like the Model Penal Code and the Criminal Justice Act. So one is to think about a rights-based framework. So instead of, if we just have retribution, deterrence, and rehabilitation together, there'll be inevitable clashes. So we need a new framework to think about how we can weigh up how we utilize them, how they are used. And one way of thinking about this framework is to look to our old friends Hegel and Green and others, and think about a framework of rights. And adopting this language of punishment as a restoration of right, that when we punish, what we're trying to do is recognize publicly, honor, the rights that we want to affirm and reaffirm. That's one of the goals that punishment tries to do. So we think about crimes as forms of rights violations. Now, a common way of thinking about criminalization, this is a standard first lecture about criminalization, is thinking about avoiding harm. Harm somehow demarcates this, that what defines criminal offenses are that they are harms to people or to self. But part of the problem of this, of course, is that not all harms are things we want to criminalize. So, some people in the room may not like boxing, but other people have different views. So boxing, right, is where people cause harm to each other. Sometimes grave harm to each other. It also happens sometimes in contact sports. But the fact that people harm and hurt and break legs and other things and noses doesn't mean, therefore, that we criminalize this behavior, because we certainly don't. And there's not much call for it right now. I've not been very good at persuading people to ban boxing. Likewise, another bad proxy, another bad, unreliable way of thinking what should be crimes and not crimes, is looking at morality. So, when we think about many criminal offenses, it might seem that morality is a good and ready guide. So, do not steal, thou shalt not kill. Well, that sounds pretty good. As good guys, every society has different versions of those kinds of principles. But you rarely see things like, thou shalt not drive your car 1 more mile over the speed limit, especially if you've got a car who can handle it. You've got great reflexes, and you're showing you can care for others because of your great driving acumen, Michael Schumacher and others. But there's a lot of offenses, crimes, that aren't clearly criminal because of the fact that they are immoral, that you're doing some kind of sin because you're doing those. Likewise, these are also unreliable for cashing out what criminal offenses should be or not be. What's interesting to me about that claim, this rejection of what's called legal moralism in the trade, is this. The British idealists, the interpreters of Hegel today, trying to bring his work to modern attention, are also likewise very concerned about these kind of issues too. That punishment is about crime. It's not about making people moral, and in fact, people should have a right to do wrong. That there's a value in people having a space to be immoral, even if you thought those things are immoral, for the lessons we can learn individually and grow, etc., and so forth. So immorality shouldn't be criminalized even where we all agree certain things might be immoral on that view. So if we think about crimes as rights violations, as a better proxy for marking out the kinds of things we want to include for what we might want to punish people for doing, then punishment should be understood as a response to crime, where we try to protect and maintain the rights we have. So we look to a restoration of rights in that way. And if punishment isn't necessary for that project, it doesn't serve any kind of purpose towards that end, then pardons can be justified. So this kind of perspective can make some sense of pardons, and it can make some sense of change over time. It brings about what I call in the book penal pluralism, so a view about punishment bringing together multiple penal principles or purposes, and thinks that's the way forward. Instead of thinking about retribution versus deterrence, rehabilitation, instead of thinking about what these purposes are in those different views, it's about giving people, not punishing the innocent, whatever that means. It's about crime reduction where possible. It's about reform, because most offenders are coming out. That these are all goods, and they all serve the end of the protection of rights. There's less crime, reformed offenders will have less violations of our rights. Now, one thing that came up when I was working on this Hegelian view of punishment in the modern context was, thanks, Tom, but how do you apply it? What does it look like? Let's see some unified theory of punishment now, what I've called the unified theory of punishment. The name I've given this is punitive restoration, and it's a rethinking of restorative justice. So let me say something very quick about this for those who may not know much about what restorative justice is. We might think the standard way of thinking about criminal justice is someone's charged with an offense, and there are some kind of court proceedings that you're in court. But in fact, and there's a trial. Of course, that's the stuff of movies, of very good novels, and so on. But the fact is, that's very, very rare. So most people give an early plea of guilt to get a sentencing reduction, Only about, 4% of cases, in criminal law in England and Wales are tried. 96% don't go to a trial. It's 98% for my friends in the room from Scotland. It's about 94-95% for any fellow Americans. One of the problems of that system of doing things is the victim feels wildly dissatisfied. There's no chance to get public acknowledgement for the wrongs that happened to him or her. They never have a say in court to say what happened, their experience of the harm felt, received. And no chance to have the offender say, I'm sorry. It almost always speaks through legal advice on legal advice. Restorative justice has many aims. One of them is to do something different. Instead of the formal, cold process of the courtroom, to look towards the informal process of an informal mediation. So this often takes the form, I have victim-offender community has this kind of three groups here. The most common form is the victim-offender mediation of the victim and offender together with the facilitator in a room, and less common form, conferencing, where there could be members of someone's partner or members of the local community there. Where the offender recognizes and acknowledges their guilt, the victim has a chance to talk, describe what happened, to confront the person who did some harm to him or her. Other members of the community have a chance to talk too, if present, and the offender has a chance to say, in often his, because often him, his words, apology. It's an effort for the victim to see that the person who did something to them was not a faceless monster lurking in the bushes, but a real-life person right there. Likewise, the offender gets to see that his or her actions, criminal actions, had consequences they probably didn't appreciate. In the conversation, they try to identify the risk factors of an offender and the agreed contract, targeted to the particular needs of the offender. The common the common contract people have is a drug and alcohol treatment regime is agreed to, some kind of community sentencing, community service, and compensation to victims. It's a standard kind of thing that often happens. What we find is less reoffending, often up to 25% less. We find higher participant satisfaction. That sounds very bureaucratic. So you have much higher victim satisfaction, much higher offender satisfaction in the process, and at significantly lower costs. So one famous, often cited study found that for every £1 you spent on restorative justice, you could save £9. So you can see why politicians are really attracted from all parties to restorative justice. It's the money, not so much the effects of it. But the problem with restorative justice, the problem that its advocates have, is getting more of it. So the public has often seen, what studies sometimes have happened, that restorative justice is seen as a soft option, because restorative justice as practice, Northern Ireland is an exception, is a particular exception, but as is practiced most places, there is no possibility of hard treatment. There's no prison, there is no kind of facility that you are confined in and you can't get out until you complete a certain regime. That is not allowed under most restorative contracts. And that's actually what motivates a lot of people who are for restorative justice. They're for the abolition of prison. Where Michael Howard said prison works, they say prison does not work, is their mantra. They develop this as an alternative to that. Now, one problem with this, as I've said, is problem of public confidence, of getting the public to sign up to us. And I have colleagues like Jonathan Doak and former colleague David O'Mahony who had strong views, who would argue that what we need to do with restorative justice, if the public thinks it's a soft option, well, they won't think that if they were in the room too. We just need to keep pushing. We can get this through. So there's a Durham debate about restorative justice. My view is that if we want to have more restorative justice, if we want to have these benefits extend to other areas and in the criminal justice system, the way to embed it more greatly is to allow for more options, including a more punitive option. The thought is, in giving restorative justice more bite, more options, it can go beyond its current limited format. So at the moment, restorative justice is the province of minors committing minor offenses. So it's largely youth justice, with only a few exceptions. To extend it to other groups, then maybe a more punitive element might be useful. One way of thinking about that punitive element is thinking about heavier sanctions for contract violations. At the moment, if I violate my restorative justice contract in any jurisdictions, then I've been a naughty boy. But what happens is I go back and have another meeting, and we talk about it some more, or I enter the formal court process and I can plead not guilty without this coming back to haunt me. That seems wrong. It seems to not take seriously enough the contracts that people enter into and the seriousness that we should give it. And so one thought is to give it a bit more bite. You can avoid prison through honoring a restorative justice contract, but if you don't, there could be something more serious if you break it. Part of the thought of extending the options is not to use them all the time, but it's in making restorative justice have a greater punitive element. The thought is that punitiveness of the criminal justice system as a whole would decrease. So it can be a more progressive way of thinking about criminal justice. It's also the unified theory in action. Offenders get what they deserve. Only the innocent are punished. You have to accept and agree you are guilty of the crime as an offender to participate at all. It's targeted to addressing your risk factors and enabling your rehabilitation. It's about doing desert, about doing crime reduction, and about doing offender reform. If you're looking for one place of how do you do a unified theory of retribution, deterrence, and rehabilitation, I recommend restorative justice as one way of doing it, and this being my model for one of the many ways in which you could cash that out. Now, some of you might be thinking, so good, hopefully, Hegel has something to contribute to how we think about criminal justice and sentencing. I'm going to spend less time talking about two more issues before closing. One problem that Hegel identifies uniquely is the problem of alienation in society, and its problem as a problem for theories of political justice. So when we think about whoever our favorite philosophers might be, who work on justice, if we have any favorite philosophers in this area, alienation is something that just doesn't really come up for the major figures. For Plato, we each do our craft, and so long as we're each serving our role in society, the philosopher kings rule us against their will, then we have justice. For John Rawls, so long as we govern and recognize principles of justice that constrain our behavior, our activity, and then we determine our public policies through use of public reasons any one of us could endorse, we've got justice. That I am alienated and don't participate or don't want to participate, neither here nor there. We have justice. For Hegel, you can't have justice where alienation has taken root. You certainly don't have any ideal of justice you should be satisfied with. His comments on this come from his discussion of a crisis in capitalism. So when he's talking about the market economy, he says, in the philosophy right, and I have a punk group, The Rabble, no clue, no future. I think a good summary of what The Rabble's view is. They have no future, and they are cut out. When a large mass of people sinks below the level of a certain standard of living, that feeling of right, integrity, and honor, which comes from supporting oneself by one's own activity, is lost. This leads to the creation of a rabble. So what marks the rabble out is a conviction about themselves, a conviction about how they feel about right, which is, he's using Recht for those who look at the text, so this is a view of right, a kind of a political right, legal right, integrity and honor. But it's not just about how much money is in your pocket. So in clarifying his comments on this section, he says, poverty in itself does not reduce people to a rabble. So the fact that you might be in severe poverty, that you lack money, doesn't mean you're necessarily a member of a rabble. A rabble is created only by the disposition associated with poverty, by inward rebellion against the rich, against society, the government, and etc. And he later will go on to say that the wealthy can be members of a rabble too. What characterizes the rabble is not how much money is in their pocket, or how big their house is, or how wonderful their car is, new and otherwise. But instead, it's about a conviction about oneself in relation to others in the community. It's a feeling of the society that I find myself in is one that does not include me. It's a society that cuts me out. It's a society where they come up with their laws, impose in their way, in their clubs. They say I have a vote and I can participate. But the rabble say, it'll come to nothing. It won't matter. As much as I try, as much as I talk, no one will listen. And this problem of disconnection and alienation, Hegel says, is the problem of modern society for which he had no solution. Now, one thing I think is fascinating about this problem of alienation is it leads to thinking about how this problem should be addressed. And so, Hegel argues you're allowed to laugh for a philosophical reconciliation. And I have here David Miliband, who was a defender of a certain view to tackle a kind of alienation in thinking about economy and society. So, in the early years before the 1997 general election, Tony Blair gave a famous speech, for those who follow it, on how he was going to build a stakeholder economy, built off of work by Will Hutton and others. And the idea of a stakeholder economy, which Hegel would want to extend to not just thinking about justice for an economy, but for a society, is this thought that economics is not just about what firms want or don't want. Companies need not be and aren't always the bad guys. We all have a stake in our economic future. As people with a stake in this future, we all should have a say in its management and governance. And we all should have a conviction about ourselves as stakeholders in governance of economics and so on. Because we're stakeholders. It's not enough that we could have a say, have opportunities. It's important that we have a kind of conviction. Now, this view of stakeholding, sadly, David and others gave up on. But Hegel calls us to think about this anew. The problem of the rabble, it's a problem about the failure of stakeholding. People in the rabble are alienated because they look to society as a place that they do not have a stake in. They are not stakeholders in. They lack that conviction even if opportunities are available to them. They see society as an other set up against them. In the words of T.H. Green, whose image I presented earlier, the Victorian British idealist, they have a consciousness of oneself is forever thwarted. No matter how much I try, I will get nowhere. Philosophy of exasperation. Justice is more than our opportunities, but it's about our shared convictions. And if we're going to think about political justice, it has to be more than just what principles we are guided by, but our commitments together to them. And that's part of what I think Hegel is on about. And one example, quickly, I'll give before turning to one last topic, is Hegel's, I think, fascinating argument of the jury trial. And it might be interesting to some that Hegel would be a defender of the jury trial. Well, anyone who knows anything about his biography knows that he was almost infatuated with Napoleon, who he saw march into Jena at the fall of Jena, and he called Napoleon the world spirit, a world historical individual on horseback. And Napoleon liked jury trials. So that might have something in the background. Hegel notes that purely professional courts may manage cases better than alternatives. That it might be a more efficient judicial system, which he thought was part of an executive branch, typical for 19th century Germany. Fichte had the view as well. That even though they could be more efficient and better, they're more knowledgeable, more experienced, they know the law better than many others. It ought not be our model for thinking through the administration of justice. Instead, we should look to the jury trial. The jury trial is to be preferred, he says, to prevent the knowledge of right and justice in our society and its pursuit becoming the property of a class which makes itself exclusive. And the thought is something like this. If justice in our courtrooms was only a conversation amongst professional lawyers, if it was only lawyers and judges having a chat about what the charges are, what the relevant evidence might be, and whether or not things stick, the person in the dock, not so trained, doesn't have the benefit of a Durham Law School education, might not understand why they're there in the first place, why the case was dropped, or why things succeeded. This is a problem because the law is not the property of the lawyers alone. The law is the property of us. Why? Because we're all stakeholders in this society. We all have a stake in it. We all have a connection to it. And to retain this sense of common belonging, it's important we have things like the jury trial, which Hegel thinks is the best we can have as a guarantee that if I'm in the dock, all things considered, the jury says I'm done for, well, I should recognize that. Or if not, that could be a sign, some evidence for me that, yes, I am innocent and I understand why that's the case. If it doesn't happen, if we don't have a jury trial, then this might not be revealed to me. So it's an instance, I think, of many of how the stakeholder view, you can find it in Hegel's view, and how it connects with things today. And interestingly, with the jury trial, when successive governments try to scrap it, or get ever close to scrapping it, Hegel is a welcome reminder to us of why it's something worthy of retention for common citizens. It might be an inconvenience, but an inconvenience worth having. Now, it wouldn't be right if I didn't mention the citizenship test. And I'm going to close with some comments on this, and yes, I'm going to throw some questions at you. Otherwise, you'd be disappointed. Hegel, at the heart of his view of political justice, has his view of stakeholding and his connection between you and I, and he develops it with his view of citizenship. Citizenship is essential to his political view of justice in the philosophy of right and elsewhere. What must citizens share? Now, this is now a common topic in our schools, where British values are coming back. And what does it mean to have Britishness or not? Is Britishness about certain particular kinds of things? And how should it be tested? How do we find it? So one way in which successive governments since 2005 have tried to test it is through a citizenship test. Looking at it, you can see all the things that are wrong with it. Well, the way it's been done. Should it be a test of practical knowledge? So to be British is to know that there are queues. To know that if you spill a pint in a pub, you should apologize and offer to buy another round. That was a question in the first edition of the citizenship test of this great country you and I share today. Oh, yes. So should it test that kind of knowledge? Is that the kind of practical knowledge that we should have on a test? Or no? Some might think, well, yeah. Some of those records is obviously good. Anyway. Or should it test political knowledge? So to be a citizen is to know there's a prime minister, that there's secretaries of state, what they are, how the courts function, or not. Or is there more to being a citizen than knowing government structures, knowing the things knowing about political jobs that the politicians have? Or should the test have cultural knowledge? So should the test be about things like who lived when, and who won what battle long ago, or what we eat in, what's a common treat, so we all have, if we're lucky, Yorkshire puddings and sticky toffee puddings, is that what makes us British or English or other kinds of things? To be Cornish, must you like pasties, and so on. Should tests have these kinds of knowledge or not? Well, the test, in various forms, has tried to cash this out, and badly. I'll give you only a couple quick examples and close. One of my favorite questions from the second edition of the test, a question that was on my test when I took it in 2009 is how many parliamentary constituencies are there? Of course, it's A, B, C, and D. This is taken verbatim from the then citizenship test book. Who thinks A? Who thinks B? Good, thank you, says the Dutchman. Who says C? Who says D? Okay, technically you're all wrong. So, the correct answer for the test was C. That was true, to get correct on the test. But it was factually untrue in the world. So, there were actually 650 constituencies in 2009, but that didn't stop the politicians from saying that was the correct answer. And when they talk about taking immigration very seriously, this shows you how seriously they take it. None had any idea that this was true. You could actually take a test of incorrect answers. So, one thing that this shows us is if we're going to have political knowledge, it should at least be accurate. That's a starting thing. Here's one from the current test. Is a statement below true or false? Catherine Howard was the sixth wife of Henry VIII. Now, I'll spare you any embarrassment. Of course, technically, those in the room, some of you will be aware that there were annulments in King Henry's past, and so were there really 6 wives and so on? That's a question for another day. The true answer here, of course, is that it is false. She was the 5th wife, not the 6th. You get this wrong, you could be sent home. So this is an example by the current government of we should have immigrants know cultural knowledge to make you British, Tom Brooks and others. And if you know stuff like this, it's a sign you're one of us. Hegel won't like this kind of talk. Likewise, this is a wonderful one from the current text. What is a responsibility you will have? Good, you're supposed to laugh. As a citizen or permanent resident of the UK. So A, using your car as much as possible. Those who think Britain is Americanizing and so on, some might say, yes, that A must be true. That's your responsibility. Stop using the bus. B, visiting your local pub regularly. Many camera will argue this, right? We're not using our pubs enough. They know this is a distinctive part of British life that many people from international, countries, I came here, I was surprised by local pub culture. Many might think B is true. C, keeping an allotment, a very curious, distinctive pastime for a lot of people. Or D, looking after the environment. Now, to spare you all embarrassment, the correct answer for the citizenship test right now today on this question is D. So when you close your eyes and you think about your most essential, now some of us who work in environmental justice, that's right, yeah, it's definitely looking after the environment, that's true. But think about your most essential things that would be earmarked for making you British. This would be the kind of question, that would be the kind of answer, you might be surprised at what you find. So what I want to end with is Hegel offers us a different view about what citizenship should be about. Often when we think about what it is, and we look at how the tests are played out, and I think this is true in the Netherlands, but I'll be corrected later perhaps, and elsewhere, is that the tests often test specific cultural knowledge, political knowledge, practical stuff, about different everyday kinds of things that might be peculiar to a society, but a question mark remains over whether or not they really mark out this is what it means to be British, this is what it means to be Dutch, the Swedes have a test, and so on. Hegel and the British idealists think that citizenship is best understood as a kind of ethical citizenship centered on an idea of the common good. That to be a citizen was to participate in a common good, to be active in a common good with each other. But of course, part of the critique for some is that that idea, what if I've got a different view about the good? What if we disagree about things? Must we all have the same view? Is it totalitizing, and so on and so forth? But another way of thinking about this connection in a Hegelian framework, and why it should matter, help us think about these issues today, is thinking about citizenship as principles of association. What are the principles that we abide by? What are the things that are common to being British, or being American, or being something else? And thinking about these principles in such a way that it's inclusive of all current and prospective members. So to say that to be British, you must know certain things about soap operas assumes that you must know and like and enjoy soap operas. That is also one of the questions. Which of the following is a soap opera? Coronation Street is an answer, Emmerdale's an answer. Another thing we might wonder about how inclusive it is to say that to be English or to be Scottish or Welsh, there are certain distinctive foods that you eat if you're there, or certain patron saints you recognize and honor, and certain dates and so on that you have in your collective historical memories. And one of the things that Hegel and the Hegelian perspective points out to us is that that is a bad way of thinking about citizenship. It's bad because when you think about citizenship in those ways, but these peculiar things that include some and exclude others of the people here and now who are citizens today, you alienate some from that collective narrative of who it is to be British or American or something else. You exclude some in having and looking at practices and certain things in that way. There hasn't been enough thought about that. And instead, we should be thinking about the kinds of principles that we can all sign up to. Fair play, equality, and so on. You might think things along that line. Ultimately, that was what happened when Sir Bernard Crick was asked by his old tutee, a guy you might have heard of called David Blunkett, to come up with the citizenship test. And he was asked to come up with an idea about what Britishness was. And in the end, they came up with the conclusion, it didn't come to much. But really it was just a series of principles, and principles that were true in Britain as they were in France, or Germany, or elsewhere, or China, or elsewhere perhaps. The Hegelian perspective is there's a certain kind of framework, certain view of principles we should all sign up to. That's necessary. So none of us are alienated. But we can implement these things and realize them in our own way. So what it means to have a view of equality and so on can be fleshed out in one distinctive way in one country versus another. The way these things are substantiated can differ, but the general principles are the same. So there's a kind of universal view of right that might all govern what it means to be a good citizen in a just state, but how we understand it can be different. So there can be difference within that kind of framework. And Hegel, I think, helps us draw attention, even if there's much more to cash out. Of course, his philosophy all in outline. Of a new critical stance, some way of thinking about how we could correct the problems that are clearly evident in the questions that exist now. So to close, I've tried to offer some examples today about not just who Hegel was, but why Hegel is relevant, why I think he matters. Not just because important people in the history of philosophy thought he was important, like Marx and Nietzsche and others who are very critical of his view, but he helps us think more clearly, I think, anew about what punishment can be, how it can be justified in a unified view, practices like a punitive restoration, as I've tried to highlight. He also highlights the problem of alienation, missing in all major theories of justice today, and the importance of stakeholding for it. That's important is not just the capabilities and opportunities we have to act in our state, but also the convictions we have about how we relate to others. And finally, this idea about citizenship being bound not just in we have a collective historical narrative, because that will be a narrative some will have that others will see very differently, perhaps even oppressive. It's not about particular practices that might be true in some parts and not others. It's certainly not regional dialects, right, that some have in some parts of the country and don't have elsewhere. Instead, we should think about citizenship in terms of principles. So these are kind of three broad ways in which I think Hegel can and does matter. A final thought. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming tonight to my lecture. I hope you've seen something new, understood something new about what Hegel has to say. And I end with this thought. Hegel comments in one of his more famous early works, The Phenomenology of Spirit, how we see spirit emerging in the world. He talks about getting drunk on the absolute, on absolute knowledge. The true is thus the bacchanalian revel in which no member is not drunken. Perhaps we won't reach any bacchanalian revel tonight, but I hope you'll join me after this talk so I can thank you personally for coming out tonight. Thank you very much. Wow.